Golden Boy's quick downfall. Sage Northcutt was pushed as the UFC's Golden Boy when he signed at 19 in 2015, marketed as both an athlete and a poster child. A karate black belt from Texas with a gymnastics background, his ripped physique and polite demeanor made him a sponsor's dream. Dana White signed him after just 6 pro fights, making Northcutt the youngest fighter on the roster at the time. The UFC gave him favorable matchups against veterans like Cody Pfister and Enrique Marin, where his explosive kicks and athleticism shone. But the hype unraveled once he faced skilled grapplers. In December 2016, submission specialist McGee took him down in the opening round and finished him with a rear naked choke, exposing his undeveloped ground game. Losses piled up. Bryan Barberena overpowered him with pressure, and Zach Otto neutralized him on the mat across 3 rounds. Hoping for a reset, Northcutt signed with 1 championship in 2019. Instead, he suffered a catastrophic knockout against Cosmo Alexandre just 29 seconds into his debut, fracturing his face in 8 places. Multiple surgeries followed, and the fighter once billed as Super Sage saw his career momentum collapse permanently. Liverpool's fallen champion. Darren Till rose as Liverpool's chosen one, debuting in the UFC in 2015 with an undefeated record and a brash confidence that matched his knockout power. His breakout came in May 2018 when he dismantled Donald Cerrone in his hometown, finishing him with a crushing elbow and igniting a raucous Liverpool crowd. With charisma, trash talk, and a strong UK fan base, the UFC positioned Till as the next British superstar. The promotion fast-tracked him into a title eliminator against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson at UFC Liverpool. Till edged a controversial decision despite questions about his size and cardio, earning a welterweight title shot only 4 months later. Against champion Tyron Woodley, Till's weaknesses were brutally exposed. Woodley dropped him with a straight right and submitted him in the second round with a Darce choke, halting the hype in decisive fashion. Till moved to middleweight in search of a fresh start, but the momentum never returned. In 2019, Jorge Masvidal silenced London with a second-round knockout, and later losses to Robert Whittaker and Derek Brunson cemented his decline. Once pushed as a future champion, Till's hype train collapsed under the weight of his defensive flaws and inconsistency at the highest level. Viral KO artist exposed. Johnny Walker burst onto the UFC scene in 2018 with a string of viral knockouts that made him one of the most exciting light heavyweight prospects in years. The Brazilian used his 6 feet 6 inches frame and wild striking to overwhelm opponents like Khalil Roundtree and Justin Ledet, finishing them in under 2 minutes combined. His flying knee knockout of Misha Cirkunov in March 2019 cemented his reputation as the division's most unpredictable threat. But Walker's rise unraveled almost as quickly as it began. Against Corey Anderson at UFC 244, his reckless style backfired when Anderson clipped him early and finished him with ground and pound. That loss revealed defensive gaps that future opponents exploited. Subsequent defeats to Nikita Krylov, Jamahal Hill, and Magomed Ankalaev showed his inconsistent chin and lack of wrestling depth. Once touted as John Jones's heir apparent, Walker's hype collapsed under the reality that highlight reel explosiveness could not cover fundamental flaws at the elite level. CM Punk Killer's reality check. Mickey Gall entered the UFC with enormous spotlight after being chosen to face former WWE star CM Punk in 2016. With just 1 professional fight, the New Jersey grappler submitted Punk in the first round, instantly gaining mainstream attention. He followed with another submission win over fellow prospect Sage Northcutt, giving the impression of a fast-rising star. However, Gall's limitations became clear as the competition stiffened. In 2017, Randy Brown controlled him over 3 rounds, exposing his undeveloped striking. Later losses to fighters like Diego Sanchez and Mike Perry further highlighted his one-dimensional style. While his jiu-jitsu remained dangerous, Gall never developed the wrestling or stand-up game to succeed against well-rounded opponents. The fighter once famous for derailing CM Punk's crossover experiment saw his own hype dissolve into a journeyman career, proving that early spotlight can fade quickly when skills don't evolve. Undefeated wrestler humiliated. Ben Askren arrived in the UFC in 2019 as an undefeated former Olympian and Bellator and 1 champion. His funky wrestling style and trash talk made him one of the most anticipated signings in years. Askren's debut against Robbie Lawler was chaotic. He absorbed a brutal slam and heavy punches before locking in a controversial bulldog choke to secure the win. For a moment, the hype seemed justified, but his second fight ended in disaster. At UFC 239, Jorge Masvidal sprinted across the cage and landed a flying knee just 5 seconds into the bout. Askren was knocked unconscious instantly, setting the record for fastest KO in UFC history. The shocking finish became a viral moment that defined his UFC run. A follow-up loss to Damian Maia via submission ended his brief stint. Once hyped as an unbeaten grappling savant, Askren's hype train collapsed under the weight of age, defensive holes, and one of the sport's most iconic knockouts. Marketing darling derailed. Paige VanZant broke into the UFC in 2014 at just 20 years old and was quickly marketed as the next crossover star. With a bubbly personality, striking looks, and an aggressive striking style, she became a mainstream figure, appearing on Dancing with the Stars and landing endorsements outside the cage. Her early wins over Beck Rawlings and Alex Chambers fueled talk of her becoming a future title contender. The momentum stalled once she faced elite opponents. In 2015, Rose Namajunas dominated her for 4 rounds before finishing with a rear naked choke, exposing gaps in VanZant's grappling. Later losses to Michelle Waterson, Jessica Rose Clark, and Amanda Ribas reinforced those weaknesses. Injuries and long layoffs further hurt her consistency. By 2020, her UFC record sat at just 5-4 before she left for bare-knuckle boxing. Despite enormous promotional backing, VanZant never delivered championship results, and her hype collapsed as quickly as it rose. From unbeaten to knocked out, James Vick entered the UFC through The Ultimate Fighter in 2012 and quietly built a strong record, climbing to 13-1 by 2018. Standing 6 feet 3 inches at lightweight, his height and reach gave him a natural advantage, and his 4-fight winning streak included finishes of Joe Duffee and Polo Reyes. The UFC promoted him as a dark horse contender, with analysts calling him one of the division's toughest outs, but his rise ended violently. In August 2018, Justin Gaethje flattened Vick with a right hand just 87 seconds into their main event, handing him a knockout loss that instantly shifted his reputation. After that defeat, Vick's chin became a glaring liability. He was knocked out in subsequent fights by Dan Hooker and Nico Price, and his UFC career closed on a 4-fight losing streak. Once considered a serious lightweight threat, Vick's hype collapsed into one of the fastest declines in divisional history. Bantamweight phenom shattered. Thomas Almeida debuted in the UFC in 2014 as an undefeated Brazilian striker with a record of 18-0. His aggressive Muay Thai style and knockout power made him one of the most hyped bantamweight prospects ever. Early wins over Brad Pickett and Yves Jabouin showcased his dynamic offense and earned him 4 straight UFC victories. By 2015, many viewed Almeida as a future champion in the making. His trajectory was destroyed in 2016 by Cody Garbrandt. In their headlining bout, Garbrandt's speed and boxing precision overwhelmed Almeida, ending his undefeated run with a first-round knockout. That loss exposed Almeida's defensive vulnerabilities, particularly against elite strikers. Over the next few years, he struggled to recover, losing to Jimmy Rivera, Rob Font, and Jonathan Martinez. Once touted as the next big thing at 135 pounds, Almeida's hype collapsed, leaving him remembered as a talent whose rise ended in one devastating knockout. Tough sensations, inconsistency. Uriah Hall became a breakout star on The Ultimate Fighter 17 in 2013, with a string of spectacular knockouts, including a spinning heel kick that remains one of the show's most famous highlights. Dana White and fellow fighters labeled him a future champion before he even made his official UFC debut. With explosive striking and a calm demeanor, Hall was billed as the next Anderson Silva. But when the real competition began, Hall's inconsistencies surfaced. He lost the tough finale to Kelvin Gastelum by split decision, then dropped fights to John Howard and Rafael Natal in bouts where he seemed hesitant to pull the trigger. Although Hall scored impressive wins over Gegard Mousasi and Anderson Silva later in his career, he never sustained momentum. Losses to Chris Weidman, Paulo Costa, and Sean Strickland kept him outside title contention. Hall's hype collapsed not from a single brutal loss, but from years of unfulfilled potential, as he remained an enigma rather than the superstar many expected. Wizard, grounded by reality. Ryan Hall entered the UFC with a reputation as one of the best submission artists in the world. After winning The Ultimate Fighter in 2015, he built mystique with his mastery of the heel hook, a dangerous leglock submission. His upset victory over BJ Penn in 2018 with a rolling heel hook boosted his aura as a grappling wizard who could finish anyone on the ground. The hype unraveled when opponents neutralized his one-dimensional approach. In 2021, Ilia Topuria pressured him relentlessly, shutting down Hall's rolling entries and finishing him with ground and pound. Lacking strong wrestling and consistent striking, Hall struggled to bring fights into his submission realm against elite competition. His sporadic schedule and injuries further stalled momentum. While respected as a specialist, the hype around him as a unique contender collapsed once rivals figured out how to negate his leglock game. Colorful strikers, painful setback. Sean O'Malley entered the UFC through Dana White's Contender Series in 2017, dazzling with his flashy striking and rainbow-colored hair. His confident personality and knockout power quickly made him one of the most marketable young fighters on the roster. By 2020, he was undefeated at 12-0 and being promoted as a future star of the bantamweight division. The hype took a major hit at UFC 252 against Marlon Cheeto Vera. Early in the fight, O'Malley suffered nerve damage in his leg from a checked kick, leaving him unable to move properly. Vera capitalized, finishing him with elbows and punches on the ground. Though O'Malley later returned to success, the loss created the "hype train derailed" narrative that followed him for years. Critics questioned his durability and ability to handle adversity. While he ultimately climbed back to a championship, that early stumble showed how quickly hype can collapse when a rising star is exposed under the spotlight. Wrestling prodigy's harsh lessons. Aaron Pico was one of the most decorated prospects ever signed by a major MMA promotion. Bellator secured him in 2014 when he was just 17, with a background as a world-class wrestler, Golden Gloves boxer, and youth pancration champion. By his 2017 debut, analysts called him the greatest prospect in MMA history. The debut turned disastrous. At Bellator 180, Zach Freeman submitted Pico with a guillotine choke just 24 seconds into the first round. The shocking loss was followed by another defeat to Henry Corrales in 2019, where Pico was knocked out in a wild exchange. While Pico eventually rebounded with improved training and a winning streak, the aura of invincibility was gone. The fighter once expected to dominate from day one became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overhyping young prospects too quickly. Next, Anderson Silva that wasn't. Erick Silva arrived in the UFC in 2011 as a 26-year-old Brazilian welterweight with explosive striking and slick submissions. His early finishes over Luis Ramos and Charlie Brenneman led commentators to dub him the next Anderson Silva. With a highlight reel style and athleticism, Silva was viewed as a future star in a stacked division. The momentum never lasted. In his third UFC fight, veteran John Fitch outgrappled Silva for 3 rounds, exposing his lack of endurance and wrestling defense. Losses piled up against opponents like Matt Brown, Neil Magny, and Nordine Taleb, often after Silva started strong but faded late. By the time he left the UFC in 2018, his record stood at just 10-8 in the promotion. Once seen as a can't-miss prospect, Silva's hype collapsed into inconsistency, remembered more for flashes of brilliance than sustained success. Iceland's hope plateaued. Gunnar Nelson entered the UFC in 2012 with an undefeated record and a reputation as a submission savant from Iceland. A black belt under Renzo Gracie, Nelson combined karate-based striking with elite grappling, earning early finishes over DeMarcus Johnson and Omari Akhmedov. His calm demeanor and technical skill led fans to label him a future contender in the welterweight division, but Nelson never broke into the elite ranks. In 2014, Rick Story pressured him over 5 rounds, handing Nelson his first career loss. Subsequent defeats to Damian Maia, Leon Edwards, and Gilbert Burns showed that while his ground game was elite, his wrestling entries and striking volume lagged behind top competition. Despite occasional submission wins, Nelson plateaued outside the top 10. His hype as Iceland's first MMA star collapsed quietly, more from limitations at the highest level than from a single dramatic loss. Lightweight Ironman crumbles. Melvin Guillard entered the UFC in 2006 as one of the most explosive athletes in the lightweight division. With fast hands and knockout power, he became a fan favorite during a long run with the promotion. Between 2010 and 2011, Guillard put together a 5-fight win streak, including knockouts of Evan Dunham and Shane Roller, pushing him into title talk. But Guillard's aggressive style left openings that opponents exploited. In October 2011, Joe Lozon stunned him with a first-round halting his streak. Losses to Jim Miller, Donald Cerrone, and Michael Johnson followed, exposing his weak submission defense. Over time, Guillard bounced between promotions but never returned to contenders. Once hyped as a future lightweight star, his hype collapsed into a career defined by Bellator champ fizzles. Hector Lombard entered the UFC in 2012 as the reigning Bellator middleweight champion with a 25-fight unbeaten streak. Nicknamed Lightning for his explosive power, Lombard's debut was one of the most anticipated in UFC history. Many expected him to immediately challenge Anderson Silva for the middleweight crown. Instead, Lombard's UFC run was underwhelming from the start. In his debut, Tim Beach outpointed him in a lackluster fight, shattering the aura of invincibility. Though Lombard scored occasional wins, including a knockout of Nate Marquardt, he failed to deliver consistent results. Losses to Yushin Okami, Neil Magny, and Anthony Smith highlighted his limitations against top-tier opponents. By the end of his UFC tenure, his record was 3-8-1. Once touted as a destroyer, Lombard's hype collapsed into one of the most disappointing transitions from Bellator to the UFC. Two-division dream unfulfilled. Brandon Vera signed with the UFC in 2005 as one of the most hyped prospects of his era. A former U.S. Air Force member with strong Muay Thai and wrestling, he promised to become the first fighter to win UFC titles in both the light heavyweight and heavyweight divisions. Early knockouts of Fabiano Schörner, Justin Eilers, and Frank Mir fueled that belief. But after a contract dispute and long layoff, Vera lost momentum. In 2007, Tim Sylvia outpointed him, exposing his size disadvantage at heavyweight. Dropping to light heavyweight, he struggled against elite competition, losing to Keith Jardine, John Jones, and Randy Couture. Though Vera later found success in one championship, capturing a heavyweight belt, his UFC run ended with an 8-7 record. Once labeled a future two-division champion, Vera's hype collapsed as inconsistency and tough losses prevented him from fulfilling lofty expectations. 7-second monster stalled. Todd Duffee entered the UFC in 2009 as a heavyweight prospect with frightening knockout power. In his debut at UFC 102, he flattened Tim Hague in just 7 seconds, setting a record for fastest KO in UFC heavyweight history. At only 23 years old, Duffee was promoted as the division's next big star. The rise ended almost immediately. In his second fight, Mike Russo absorbed a beating for 2 rounds before landing a single overhand right in the third, knocking Duffee out cold. Injuries and illness then sidelined him for long stretches, halting momentum. Duffee returned sporadically over the next decade, but never regained consistency, suffering additional knockout losses to Alistair Overeem and Frank Mir. Once hailed as a future heavyweight force, Duffee's hype collapsed into a career defined by injuries, inactivity, and missed potential. Crocop Slayer fades. Gabriel Gonzaga became an overnight star in April 2007 when he knocked out Mirko Crocop Filipovic with a head kick at UFC 70. The finish was shocking, as Crocop was one of the most feared strikers in MMA history and the favorite to win a heavyweight title shot. Gonzaga's upset put him immediately into a championship fight with Randy Couture. The title opportunity proved too much. Couture dominated Gonzaga with clinch pressure and ground and pound, breaking his nose and finishing him in the third round. After that, Gonzaga's inconsistency defined his UFC run. He scored wins over lesser competition, but repeatedly fell short against contenders like Junior Dos Santos, Stipe Miocic, and Fabricio Verdum. Despite longevity and flashes of brilliance, Gonzaga never returned to title contention. His hype collapsed after the Couture loss, remembered more for one historic knockout than for sustained success. Fan favorites fall. Jason "Mayhem" Miller built a massive following in the 2000s with his flashy entrances, wild personality, and stint as a coach on The Ultimate Fighter, Team Bisping vs. Team Miller in 2011. His charisma and grappling skills made him a cult favorite, and his UFC return was promoted as a chance to prove himself against elite competition. Instead, Miller's comeback was disastrous. Michael Bisping outclassed him in their TUF finale fight, stopping him with strikes in the third round. In his next bout, CB Dalloway dominated him with wrestling, leading to Miller's release from the UFC. Outside the cage, a series of legal issues and arrests further derailed his reputation. Once one of MMA's most recognizable personalities, Miller's hype collapsed completely, turning a beloved fan favorite into a cautionary tale about wasted potential. Lightweight Ironman crumbles. Melvin Guillard entered the UFC in 2006 as one of the most explosive athletes in the lightweight division. With fast hands and knockout power, he became a fan favorite during a long run with the promotion. Between 2010 and 2011, Guillard put together a 5-fight win streak, including knockouts of Evan Dunham and Shane Roller, pushing him into title contention talk. But Gillard's aggressive style left openings that opponents exploited. In October 2011, Joe Lauzon stunned him with a first-round submission, halting his streak. Losses to Jim Miller, Donald Cerrone, and Michael Johnson followed, exposing his weak submission defense. Over time, Guillard bounced between promotions but never returned to contender status. Once hyped as a future lightweight star, his hype collapsed into a career defined by inconsistency and defensive flaws. Leglock terror banished. Rousimar Palhares built a reputation in the UFC as one of the most feared submission artists in MMA. His powerful build and devastating leglocks made him a dangerous opponent, with multiple UFC wins via heel hook and knee bar. Fans and analysts touted him as a unique threat in the welterweight division. That hype ended in controversy. Palhares developed a pattern of holding submissions too long after opponents tapped, causing serious injuries. After ignoring referee warnings in 2013, he was released from the UFC, despite back-to-back wins. He later won the WSOF welterweight title, but was stripped after again refusing to release submissions against John Fitch and Jake Shields. Once feared as a leglock specialist, Palhares' hype collapsed under reckless conduct that left him blacklisted from major promotions.